that could foreshadow Hawaii. We're going to talk a little bit about that later on, but first I'd like you to meet my guest, whom I'm so excited is here today, because he is somebody who understands how things work in Hawaii. His name is J.N. Musto. He's the executive director of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly, and someone who really knows Hawaii. J.N., welcome to the program.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, just at the outset, when you're sitting down at the bargaining table and somebody asks, what does J.N. mean? I think you were told once, weren't you?
A machinist once told me, as he introduced me to his shop stewards, he said, for all of you who want to know what JN stands for, it's just nice.
Just nice. And I'm sure anyone who's negotiated with JN would affirm that you're just nice. You know, JN, I have to tell you, I've watched your career for so many years, but always from the outside before I got to know you. And I would see you just in the news, during labor negotiations and so forth. A lot of people only know what a union head is from the outside. And I was wondering, although we'll talk a little more later on, what at the very outset do you do as the executive director of the faculty union at the university?
Well, first of all, as far as UHPA is concerned,
Sure.
My role is chief negotiator for the faculty union.
So you're representing a group of people as they're dealing with management, so to speak.
Under Chapter 89 in Hawaii, public sector employees have the right to bargain. They're divided up now into 14 bargaining units by law. We represent one of them. That's the faculty of the university system that includes all post-secondary education, from community colleges through the law school and medical school. There are about 4,000 faculty when you include lecturers in the group, and we negotiate the contract that pertains to all of them.
So first and foremost, you're there to give a single voice to this very diverse crew of people when it comes to the issues related to their employment.
The law requires us to be an exclusive representative for that group. And that means that we must represent all of those people fairly, regardless of what their opinions of us are, regardless of where they find themselves in their circumstance. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the university faculty is hugely diverse in its opinions and views. And then when you add on the fact that we're representing 2-year liberal arts and technical schools, 4-year baccalaureate degree institutions, research
Incredible,
institutions.
the diversity.
Yes, it's huge.
And not to mention the political diversity as well, and some of the views of how society should be that are there. These are great thinkers at the university.
Absolutely. You know, the old expression, if you have 10 faculty members in a room, you have at least 12 opinions.
There you go. So, while it's pretty obvious your legal role is to represent that group to the state,
Right.
do you end up having to represent members of that group to each other? Do you have to do mediation in terms of the in-house work?
Absolutely. I mean, part of what you have to do is find the commonality of interest that spans the differences, perhaps, in opinions and other things. You know, what's the thread that binds us together? Once you have that, then you move forward. And it's like any other human endeavor. You're never going to get everybody equally on board, but that's the way you start the journey, at least.
Well, I would think a lot of our viewers would regard the occupation of a union head as rather exotic, something that we really may not see up close and behind the scenes. And so I'm hoping you'll give us a little bit of insight. In fact, let's go back a little further. How in the world did you end up in such a position? You started out in Detroit, isn't that right?
Well, I was born in Detroit.
You were born in Detroit. Made in Detroit.
Actually, I was made in Fort Hood, Texas.
All right.
During World War II, and my mother loved Fort Hood, Texas so much that she said, I will never allow a child of mine to be born here. And so she got on a train and went back to Detroit, where my mother and dad had come from, for me to be born.
And so you grew up in Detroit?
I grew up in Detroit.
How old were you when you left Detroit to go on to your life or your education?
Well, I left the Detroit metropolitan area once I had finished my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I took a job at Northern Michigan University as an assistant professor.
What was your degree in?
My degree is in law, actually, not a JD, but a PhD.
That's right. In fact, it wasn't your dissertation on a subject that you've now been able to draw upon because of that work and that expertise.
Well, this will give away a bit of my age. My dissertation was the impact of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act on public employment. And at the time, it did not apply to public employment; it only applied in the private sector. It wasn't until the 72 amendments that it applied.
What was the basic conclusion of your dissertation?
It was very specific on how you could deal with affirmative action hiring and in times of retrenchment and layoff. If you were under a court order because you had discriminated in hiring and you had then complied with the order, what happened when you had to reduce your workforce? If the first in, last out,
sure, if hiring pattern
applied, you were stuck, and you're in a position where all of the affirmative action that you had done in hiring would have been just wiped away just simply by the layoffs.
So these issues dealing with hiring, firing, affirmative action, and so forth actually prepared you well for the kind of work that you eventually ended up in.
Yeah, but it wasn't my intention. I mean, this was sort of serendipitous. It's like anything else in life. I didn't.
You don't set out and plan that.
No, I didn't wake up one morning and say, "Gee, I'd like to be the head of, a union someplace."
What were some of the professional steps in your life that kind of got you into this direction?
When I was 17 years old, actually, I went to work at Ford Motor at the Dearborn Rouge plant, and I was a member of a real union, the United Auto Workers. And actually went out on strike in 1965 or 6 with the auto workers there. I met a lot of historic labor personalities in Detroit, including Walter Reuther, and it was very informative. I mean, I was a student of the history, but to get to know men who actually lived through the 1930s and 40s organizing of Ford, and what occurred in those periods was more enlightening. The reality of it, the brutality that occurred for what people today would just absolutely take for granted, regardless if they were on the right or the left of the political spectrum.
Now, I don't know how much during that period of time you had your eye on Hawaii, but now you certainly know the history of Hawaii.
No eye on Hawaii.
What were some of the similarities or differences between union culture and the way the society was engaged? You mentioned some of the violence that took place. What's some of the difference between the Detroit experience that you had there and what was going on in Hawaii in the 40s with union organization?
It's, that's interesting. First of all, Hawaii has a history of unions built around ethnic groups.
Right.
That is not the case in
and
Detroit.
Ethnic groups that had social causes in terms of their own determinism and justice.
Right. And they also had conflicts. I mean, one of the things that was a real achievement in the movement of Hawaii labor was to bring everyone together when the Japanese, for instance, and the Filipinos could both go out on strike together against the sugar industry. Right. There's not a comparable division that occurred in Detroit. Detroit particularly did not have black unions and white unions. They were black and white, which were the major racial and ethnic divides.
It was a very defined management versus labor.
Oh yes, right. And again, too, the history of Detroit is very interesting because it drew so many of African Americans from the South to the industrially expanding Detroit. So when the unionization came, they were already a part of the workforce, which was again an integrated workforce.
When you mentioned the roughness of that time, the violence and so forth in Detroit, was there a comparable expression here in Hawaii?
Well, there was the Hilo massacre. I mean, we've had we use those words, but quite frankly, if you take a look at the massacre that occurred over the bridge leading into the Rouge plant, if you take a look at some of the other violence in Flint, Michigan, and so forth, Hawaii pales in comparison. I mean, violence is still violence. it's nothing like the unionization of the Western mines, which were really awful in the United States.
You know, I saw a very charming and compelling play down at Kumukahua about the so-called Hilo massacre. I don't know if you'd heard about that, and if it ever comes around again, it'd be worth seeing. But what it does is it gives an understanding of much of the backdrop, ethnic culture, and the relationships between people that seem to have an underlying unity in union dealings here in Hawaii, whereas that may not be present so much in a place like Detroit.
Right. By the way, if you want to read a good book, Bill Pewitt, a faculty member at West Oahu, University of West Oahu, wrote a book on the Hilo Massacre. That's he's at the Center for Labor Education and Research. It's very, very well done, and it gives a good description of what went on.
Well, before we get to a break in the next segment in just a few moments, what other professional experience prepared you for where you are today?
Well, I actually, after I left Northern Michigan University to become the executive director of two faculty unions. One was Central Michigan University, the other was Ferris State in Michigan. And I negotiated their contracts. I acted as their CEO as well. They were all part of the Michigan Education Association. And at the time, the Michigan Education Association was interested in organizing and representing K-12 school teachers. They happened to have had these two units as a residual part, and they weren't about to give them up. So they hired me just to make sure that the faculty stayed quiet, and as long as they didn't hear from them, they were happy.
You organized, you created a union, so to speak, there. And
they had been organized before I came. I stepped in and took them over, and I like to think probably took them to new heights, depending on how you define.
What style did you have? Were you, is it my way or the highway to
what style did I have?
In that setting, did you come in with a strong call for your leadership role, or were you very collaborative?
One of my heroes is Theodore Roosevelt. I think that he was an extraordinary person, and speak softly and carry a big stick. His advice is probably true in all settings. I mean, the stick doesn't need to be a weapon as much as it needs to be a commitment to take action. Lots of people can, be bellicose, they can scream and yell, but when it comes right down to actually doing something, putting it on the line, being able to potentially make a sacrifice for a greater good, I think that's the difference. That's the key.
Now, what brought you finally to the position you have today as the head of the University of Hawaii Faculty Union?
I was giving a presentation at an organization called the Center for Collective Bargaining in Higher Education that was formed in the 1970s at Baruch College, which is part of the CUNY system.
City University of New York.
Yes, and there were a group of faculty attending that meeting from UHPA that had recently taken over the representation rights from the AFT. That's a long story about how that occurred here in Hawaii. Faculty were the last public sector employee group to actually form a union in the state. There were 13 bargaining units at the time. All other public employees, from teachers, firefighters, police, civil service, all had joined unions except the faculty. In the absence of a union, everybody else got salary increases except the faculty. So the faculty, being slow but not dumb, finally moved to select a bargaining agent, which was AFT, who then unsuccessfully tried to bargain a contract. They never succeeded. They were decertified by UHPA, and then came a new leadership.
The AFT, American Federation of Teachers, and aren't they primarily secondary education in terms of the numbers that they work with?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, AFT represents proportionally more higher education in their membership than the National Education Association. So the National Education Association has about 3,200,000 members, of which are higher education.
And You recently were involved in UH letting go of its relationship with NEA, which
UHPA.
we can come back to in just
yes.
a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. My guest today on Ehana Kako, which means let's work together, is J.N. Musto, Executive Director of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly. Although we intrigued you with the question, will Hawaii become the next Detroit? I really want to get into the mind of J.N. You know, it's not often you get to sit down with the head of a union and just pick his brain. He's got much to tell us about the way things work in Hawaii. When we come back, we will get to that question, however, right after this break. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroots Institute. We will be right back after this. Aloha and welcome back to Ehana Kako, which means let's work together. We're a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of Grassroots Institute. My guest today, J.N. Musto, is head of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly. And now I've got an intriguing question for J.N., but don't answer it right away. Will Hawaii be the next Detroit? And we say this because just a few weeks ago there was the declaration that Detroit has declared bankruptcy, and it's not so much that there is a direct parallel between a city and a state, but I've been intrigued. Have you seen that a phrase pop up in some of the newspapers and online blogs and so forth? I've seen it a bit.
Right, I haven't read the article by Ms. Zimmerman, but I know that she's written one here in Hawaii about it.
Right, one recently came out, and I think it's only natural that in light of some of the economic challenges we're facing in the state, that people may ask that question. So let's just chat a little bit about what are some of the similarities and some of the differences are before we actually answer that question. I'm going to throw a big one at you. Just, Detroit for many, many years was under a very protectionist situation in the auto industry. Some people, I saw an interesting parallel saying Hawaii has been under the Jones Act and shipping protectionism for even longer period of time. Do you think there's any credence to that being a factor in making an economic comparison?
No, the relative impact on our economy by the Jones Act, which is not unsubstantial, pales in comparison to the auto industry's relationship to Detroit.
So while the Jones Act may affect the cost of goods that we ultimately get as consumers, you say that the auto industry has had just a much more pervasive influence upon economic outcomes in Detroit.
But the great irony is people tend to to forget that in the after the 1960s, there were no cars built in Detroit. The cars were all built in the suburban areas surrounding Detroit. In fact, the original Ford plant was in a city called Hamtramck, which Detroit surrounds. Henry Ford got very irritated with Hamtramck and the taxes that they were charging him, property taxes for his plant. So he literally packed it all up and in a large caravan moved it over to Dearborn, where it's an area where he was born.
Right.
He had bought up property secretly, huge amounts of property, because it was all farmland. And that's where he built the Ford Rouge complex.
So when we look at Detroit, we see a city impacted by the exodus of a massive industry that virtually everybody was involved in some way or had a relative who was employed in the industry. How would you compare that to the industrial situation in Hawaii here? A lot of people complain that there's not much diversification. Some even say we're a single industry economy in some ways if they're talking about military or if they're talking about tourism and so forth. What are your thoughts? Is that a fair comparison?
Well, there's not the same comparison with where Detroit found itself and then what happened to the industry. I mean, unless you can envision Hawaii and its main industry, which is tourism, suddenly collapsing in total, then you're not going to find a way to make analogies with Detroit.
Well, let me throw another one at you, though,
right.
that I also read. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Some have said that our single biggest industry really is, if we include the military as well, city, state, and county, and federal, is government. Government in terms of the employee base, in terms of liabilities such as health care programs, pensions, and so forth, and unfunded liability, something we talk about here. Is that a basis for comparing Hawaii's future with that of Detroit?
No, because again, Detroit lost its basic private sector support, and the value of its property fell. So even the government couldn't. There wasn't enough tax that one could raise from something that had no value anymore. So again, that comparison just does not fit. Is Hawaii unique in its economic structure? Absolutely. I think the three-legged stool of government, military, and tourism is probably a fair one. We've tried to expand the tech sector. There was an effort, interestingly, to expand the financial sector back in particularly the late 1980s.
Yes.
Which didn't go anywhere, I think, in large measure because of, again, the existing financial interests that were in Hawaii that didn't say it's a good thing to open it up to more banks coming in or international transaction. Again, it all goes back, though, to the fact that Hawaii started out as an oligarchy, and it was a kingdom. It was a business oligarchy. The Big Five ruled. Right. And that transitions its way through, and the vestiges of it remain, quite frankly.
And what does that portend for Hawaii's economic future now?
Hawaii's economic future, I believe, is dependent upon an ever-increasing population that is unsustainable in an island nation or state.
In other words, you're saying we're underpopulated for the level of economic development that we need.
We're overpopulated.
Overpopulated.
We're overpopulated, and we are going to continue to become more overpopulated. We
overpopulated in terms of the economic engine that we have,
overpopulated
as well as the environment.
In terms of the environment we live in, the literal amount of land and space, the access to water. I mean, all of those things. And it's a conundrum without a solution, because the rules we play under do not allow us to control the immigration back and forth, and certainly not the native growth of the population.
Well, let's switch comparisons. Instead of talking about Detroit, go to the opposite end of economic capacity, Singapore.
Right.
Back in the 1940s, Singapore's population was much smaller than Hawaii's. I think it was about 500,000 or less. It caught up with Hawaii and now is at maybe 1.9, 2 million, something like that. And actually they're planning for more. Singapore's land mass, no greater than that of Hawaii, but they added to it significantly. I think more than 40% is actual landfill now. Imagine Kaka'ako Park. And I was just in Singapore recently and went down to the harbors that were built in landfill as well. So if rather than go through this litany of what Singapore has done in the last 60 years and Hawaii hasn't, not to mention less protective practices in terms of shipping, do you think that there is room for growth? That's the real question I want to ask you, that there is room for growth of Hawaii and the building of the economy as well as the sustaining of a large population? Because that was an issue Singapore dealt with significantly.
There is nothing in our history since statehood that would indicate that is an outcome in the next 25 years.
Sure.
That's for sure.
We're talking about political direction here as well as social interest.
We're talking about, the entire culture, the established interest groups that exist at all levels, whether it's business, government, political, whatever. I mean, they all come together to form the matrix of Hawaii. And they aren't there by accident. It's not like somebody woke up one day and said, well, why don't we do something crazy? They're all there very purposefully and trying to pull that apart, all right, without it collapsing into chaos before it regains any kind of organization. It's really hard.
Well, what you're talking about is really being able to see the true causes behind the condition that we are in today rather than just picking out one piece. And I want to get into that conversation with you when we come back following a break. I really think that our viewers will be interested in what I'm interested in as well, and that is talking a bit about the way things work in Hawaii and how we have to understand these systems, these processes that work. But while we have a couple minutes left, let's at least be fair to our consumers today and answer the question, will Hawaii become a future Detroit?
I doubt it. I mean, look at Detroit. Detroit was a collapsing population. It fell by 40%. It occurred as, in my mind, at least in my evaluation, as the outgrowth of the racial tensions of the 1960s that led to the beginning of the race riots in Detroit in July. There were race riots in the 40s in Detroit as well.
Sure.
I mean, there was a constant dynamic between black and white populations in Detroit. But in 1967, even though the road towards maybe the auto industry expanding elsewhere, it ended because then everyone who had the financial capacity, white or black, fled Detroit for its suburbs.
So you're mentioning many social factors that we don't have present here in Hawaii, as well as perhaps an asset. Do you see our culture here as one of the strengths?
It is a strength in that Hawaii has developed a way to hold cultures together that were, at the turn of the 20th century, in huge competition with each other. And as the 20th century moved forward.
That's a good note to end this segment on. And so you've heard it directly from Jay and Musto. Don't worry, the sky is not falling. Hawaii is not going to become a future Detroit. But when we come back, we're going to delve in a little bit more into the causes behind why Hawaii is the way it is today. You know, how does Hawaii work? And again, my guest, Jay and Musto, head of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly, one of the most powerful unions here in the state, has a great deal of experience in knowing how things work. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroots Institute. You're watching a Hana Kako, a weekly program on ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We will be right back in a moment.
Very good.
Aloha and welcome back to a Hana Kako, a weekly program on ThinkTech Hawaii's broadcast network. My guest today is J.N. Musto, head of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly, and we're going to dive right back into our conversation here about the way things work here in Hawaii. J.N., I really appreciate the fact that you know how things work, whether you're haunting the halls of the legislature or you're there at Bachman Hall or whatever it is, or if you were in a nutshell to answer the question, what would you say if I just threw out at you a very general, how do things work in Hawaii? What's the basis of power and getting anything accomplished in the 50th state?
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, that's going to demand more of you than your dissertation did.
No, much more. I mean, I don't assume, even after 35 years, that I even begin to understand it. I started to learn what I didn't know here. And again, it goes back to that premise that if something here really doesn't look very smart, if it looks kind of crazy, counterintuitive, you can't assume that it's just somebody's stupidity that brought it about. It was probably purposeful, and being purposeful means that there are interests behind it that want it to be this way, even if it's inefficient, even if it's just downright kind of crazy.
Well, we have a huge number of laws and processes and structures that are in place because they've been that way for so many years. And what you're saying basically is there was a rationale as to why these things are in place.
They usually are perpetuated because there are still parties of interest that have good reasons. And again, these cross, and that's important to know. There's not a political divide that say, oh, it's all of these people over here that are the interests and these people over here are not. It goes in both directions.
Well, what's one you might want to be able to talk about as an illustration without getting yourself into trouble? You know.
Not the Jones Act. Let's not.
Right.
Well, that would have been one way you could talk.
I'll say something about.
I'll tell you.
Go ahead.
I'll tell you one.
Yeah.
One of the big issues has always been home rule.
All right.
Local control. You know, I mean.
States' rights, is that the issue you're talking about?
Not states' rights. I'm talking about county rights.
County rights, okay.
Home rule
very
is
good.
generally a county-based issue. And in most states, that's not a big issue. I mean, the dividing line between what the state has authority over, whether it comes to parks, roads, everything else, and what the counties have, are pretty well defined. And it doesn't even matter how big the counties are, relatively speaking, to each other. Here it matters terribly.
Right.
Because the city and county of Honolulu
They're contiguous.
has always been in competition with the state of Hawaii. So the state of Hawaii, and there's reasons why that's occurred, and there's lots of political history behind it. Our once mayor, Frank Fossey, had his own foreign policy. I mean, and mayors today continue to engage in their own form of foreign policy.
That's right, with sister cities all over the world.
All over, and such. The point of that is, if you took a look at this from what really makes best sense on how to divide it up, even apply that to the school district issue. You know, we have one school district for the entire state of Hawaii. Again, what seems like what shouldn't be a very controversial issue on how to best organize these political entities and parts is not so simple. And the reason that the state of Hawaii does so much more that would have otherwise been given to counties, all right, is firmly fixed within various interests that surround it. Part of them are cultural. Part of them are to keep the huge diversity of cultures we have here in a state where no one is taken advantage of. That's been since let's say the 1954 Democratic Party Revolution. We don't have a homogeneous population. We've got a conglomerate, all right? They haven't been spun together into one thing that is quote-unquote Hawaiian by any means. They remain what they are. They remain where they've come from, but they are no longer in conflict. They're attached to each other because we have certain agreements of how we are going to interact and that keeps the society stable.
Now, what you're talking about actually is a values base that has developed here in our culture, our political, our social culture. You talk about the work of Dan Inouye or John Burns and in the building of the Democratic Party, the unions and so forth, with this value that we're going to treat everyone equally.
No, what we're not going to do is we're not going to tread on your territory.
There you go. Okay.
So
thanks for parsing that.
You can believe what you want to believe as long as you don't try to make me believe something different than I want to believe. And that's at every level, like I said, at a cultural level.
Yes.
Filipino to Japanese to Caucasian to Hawaiian, each of the groups can retain their own identity, even if the belief systems may be in conflict. I mean, and that's the grand bargain.
Now, would you say this evokes the value of tolerance here, or diversity? Is that one of the overarching reasons that we treat each other this way?
It's not so much tolerance. It's the flip side of it.
Okay.
It's to keep bad things from happening, because we had a history where we knew that if based upon, and in fact, large groups used ethnic identity to build conflict between the groups.
Now, paralleling the development of our institutions in modern Hawaii was the rise of civil rights across the United States. And so the issue of justice must factor into here.
Right.
So do you think then, you talk about the previous economic oligarchy that existed in which many people would have been disenfranchised. Is it a look back to the past? Are you saying we look at these oppressive factors and we want a better future? Is this part of it, and we want to protect against that from happening again?
Well, yeah, I mean, we do want to protect from a political point of view. That's what 54 was about. That politically there was a balance. Prior to 54, there was a Hawaiian, Caucasian, Republican oligarchy of its own that controlled the politics. In 1954, the Japanese asserted themselves and they formed new partnerships, Filipinos and so forth, and they challenged that political dynamic. What came out of it, I think, is a new political dynamic that allows the conglomerate to exist in its whole. I mean, one of the interesting things that I find in Hawaii is it doesn't really matter what you call yourself in terms of a political party in the sense of the United States of America. Certainly to be called a Democrat in this state means absolutely nothing. I learned nothing about what you believe, politically, socially, or otherwise, by your telling me you're a Democrat.
Well, it's almost saying like you said earlier, you go to Central Union Church.
Right.
You've given a brand name, but what constitutes the brand?
Where's the commonality of interest?
Right.
What are those principles that we all agree to? At Central Union Church, which is, for those who don't know it, a congregational church, it was the classic grassroots democracy. There was no church hierarchy.
Sure.
There is no church dogma that is laid down upon the congregation. Rather, the dogma of the church arises from its congregation itself. Well, that's hard because people don't always agree with the same principles. In one time in the history of the United States, back in Boston, there was one congregational church, and they had a big argument over the issue of the Trinity. And is the Trinity true to the biblical assertion that there is only one God? The people who didn't believe that were called Unitarians. It was a schism. They couldn't come to agreement, the Trinitarians and the Unitarians. So they literally tossed a coin to see who would get the church, and the Unitarians won. And so the Trinitarian Congregationalists had to go across the street and build a new one.
Yeah, and do you see that as a metaphor for the way politics works here and partisan membership? And so
well, what's happened here is we never get to that debate. We never debate our Unitarianism or our Trinitarianism, as it were, as a principle. What we do is we say, we got something, we're going to call it a church, and anybody can be there. But actually, it's by calling it a church doesn't tell me anything about anything that it believes, because to be so big and all-encompassing means that every view, even ones that are absolutely diametrically opposed, have to be part of the group.
Sure.
So.
You referred to a time that was epochal, or really, if we look forward from it, for Hawaii, and that was Dan Inouye and company returning following World War II, the GI Bill, and setting us on the course we are in. Any thoughts now with the passing away of Senator Inouye and the retirement of Senator Akina as to what that portends for
the future?
The political environment for the Democratic Party?
Well, I don't think it really portends anything for the Democratic Party, because it was never about the Democratic Party, really. It was about a group of people acting in concert to get other people elected. It wasn't built upon, again, as I go back to the series of principles that they necessarily were ascribing to. And by the way, I think it's perfectly fine for groups to ascribe to principles. Even though a wise man once told me, you asked the question about being a chief negotiator, he said, if across a bargaining table you find a man of principle, be afraid, be very afraid, because a man of principle cannot compromise. It's only when you think your principles are so irrevocably correct that there can be no compromise, that either in the bargaining table or in the political arena, you get stalemate, you get no agreement. And that's the constant dynamic going back and forth.
You talk about a dynamic. Is it possible to have a core value structure that you do not compromise, and yet be able to compromise in the way you engage others and create space for commonality?
Well, I do believe that there's a place, and I think the place runs between you as the individual and how you are allowed to live your life versus what you have to place upon the entire population in terms of compliance.
Well, I would hope that that's a discussion that receives much attention amongst our government leaders, our citizens here in Hawaii, because I think that's the goal for us to live together and yet each other live in peace and harmony without interfering. This is Keli'i Akina, the president of Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, thanking Jay Fidel and ThinkTech Hawaii for allowing us to broadcast a Hana Kākou weekly program. ThinkTech Hawaii can be seen, you can look at archives of programs at thinktechhawaii.org. My guest today is J.N. Musto. We'll come back for our final segment as we talk about what's happening at the University of Hawaii. We'll be right back. Aloha and welcome back to a Hana Kako, our final segment today. We're talking with J.N. Musto, head of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly, and we get to spend a few moments now just chatting about probably your favorite place to be, the University of Hawaii.
Right.
Well, what's the latest? Right now we're in a presidential search process, and a certain step has been taken recently. You want to catch us up?
Well, for those who watch ThinkTech Hawaii, one of your own has been named the interim president. David Lasner, who is the information officer for the university, vice president, has been appointed to that position. He will likely hold it for the entire academic year, well into 2014, before they get around to being able to find an
I wouldn't put you on the spot in terms of any evaluation of that decision, but I'm interested to know what the union's thinking is about that action of appointing an interim as opposed to not appointing an interim. And is this a positive move? Is this going to be helpful in the process?
It was necessary in this circumstance to have an interim. There was no way you could make an informed decision about a permanent president in the time that you had for the succession. So in that sense, it's fine. The point, though, that has to be made is this can't be just a placeholder. There are important decisions that affect our institution that are going to have to be made in the next year and a half. They deal with the whole range of things I deal with our collective bargaining, with our contract. They deal with the funding of the university, the tuitions that students pay. They deal with having to deal with our governor and our legislature. And I think, to answer a question not already asked, I think part of what they believe that David Lasner can bring is a good public presence to the university, a person who can communicate what the university needs and why it's asking and what its responsibilities are in return.
Now I would imagine that's something to be highly valued, especially in light of the press the university has been receiving over the last couple of years. And what do you think how do you think the university has been affected by the public image that has gone forth in terms of investigations, in terms of confrontations and so forth, and their own management of that? How has the university's own reputation and capacity been affected by the media in the last couple of years?
Well, it's an unfortunate. It's taken it away from what the university actually does, which is not spend all of its time mismanaging, concerts. It's taken it away from the effective teaching and research and the service that it's doing in the broad public. And that management, or lack thereof, also doesn't insist on making research, service, teaching better. It is awful. It's a diversion. But it's a diversion that has to be addressed. And it's very unfortunate. It's... By the way, if you're interested, go Google Evan Dobell, our former president.
Yeah, what's he up to
now? He's in the news again back in Massachusetts for financial mismanagement of, I think it's Westfield University, where he's currently president.
Well, I can hear a lot of I told you so's coming out from that.
I don't understand. The problem that we had when they selected Dobell is that he had a history before he came here. And it appeared nobody examined it very well.
And so I take it that there's going to be a commitment to a much more rigorous process of due diligence as we move forward here. Would you say that the public has demanded that, or will we see more of the same?
It is my fervent hope that the Board of Regents will engage in a new level of due diligence. And I can guarantee you UHPA organizationally will do it independently. We will not be afraid to stand up and tell the community what we find as we go forward. So
you've been involved in a variety of university settings, so you understand the public, the private sector, you understand issues of autonomy and so forth. What are your thoughts about how our university is ultimately governed in terms of the multiple inputs that come from everything from the legislature to the Board of Regents, the presidency, the faculty, even to some extent the citizenry and the students and so forth? What kind of animal is this? What kind of what challenges do we face because of that?
It is a public university, and you cannot just curse the wind. That is difficult, and there are lots of people who have a public interest. What you have to do, and what's been the strength of American higher education, is public universities. So now you respond by saying, in this setting, these are the things we have to do, and this is how we are going about it. It's talking honestly about the responsibilities that faculty have, administrators have, that students have. It's talking about the duties that the state of Hawaii has towards supporting that endeavor, because it's a huge resource. Universities are huge resources to this community.
What role does this university play in the Hawaii economy? And you probably have some quantification as well, because of the research and the industry that is driven by it.
They do the multiplying effects of universities, $420 million in external monies. The grants that also hire people locally. The president of UHPA is David Duffy, a botanist. He has a grant that hires a substantial group of people who work outside the university on DLNR land across the state, all the islands. I mean, these are jobs that, in the absence of Professor Duffy and his research inquiry and then grants, wouldn't be here.
I don't think there's enough understanding of the economic role that the university plays in the public and the way in which we confront the university. For example, take the issue of salaries. People certainly are free to critique salaries and salary levels, but when we look at salaries for executives in light of the entire economic engine and capacity and output, what are your thoughts in terms of the university management?
Well, to me, it's a very simple equation. The more money that you are paid, the more responsive you must be to those who are paying it to you, and the less, quote, job security you have with it. So therefore, if you are not meeting the expectations, let's say of the Board of Regents, then, and it's time to move on, you don't have anything that looks like a golden parachute in the private sector. I mean, to me, it's offensive in the private sector when failed CEOs walk away with millions and millions of dollars. In the public sector, it borders on being criminal.
Well, J.N., you're talking about something very much on our heart at Grassroots Institute. It's accountability.
Right.
That's basically what it is. So, and what are your thoughts about accountability taking place as we move forward with our institution, the university?
We have to be accountable. Again, we are a public entity. What has to occur, though, is you've got to be able to articulate what that accountability actually translates into. What are the things that we want the university to be accountable for? I mean, is it a winning season for the football team?
Sure.
I mean, is that the measure? I mean, if you determine what the things are that we're to be accountable for, then we can measure those against the resources that have been allocated to us and come out with an answer.
And who is it ultimately responsible for setting that list of priorities, those bottom lines, the deliverables that are necessary by which we measure the effectiveness of the university?
I believe it's between the Board of Regents, the legislature, and the governor, as we are politically organized in this state as applies to the university.
And are you talking about something as simple as a statement that says these are the measurements that we will look at in evaluating?
Well, it's as simple as a continuing of look at what are reasonable expectations for us to have as a portion of this, understanding the entire scope that the university covers, the arena, the disciplines,
Certainly.
and so forth.
I would love to carry on this conversation a lot longer with you, but I want to close with giving you a minute to describe something you told me about when we had lunch, and that is how you negotiate in terms of finding that sweet spot rather than focusing on a bunch of unrelated issues. I love that philosophy.
Well, I mean, the the whole definition of the scope of bargaining for us is pretty clearly defined. We're looking at the working conditions, the wages, the kinds of issues that are directly related to the employment setting, and not necessarily the tangential things which people might agree are good things to attend to, but maybe more appropriate for another organization or another group. We try not to expand ourselves beyond our duty of fair representation as the exclusive representative of the faculty for wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment.
In other words, you're able to bring people together around a very clear, limited set of goals and values.
Yes, we're not your moral compass. Okay, you are your own moral compass. You decide on the issues that you want to do. But when it comes to that definition, those things that impact you in your working environment, as public employees, which faculty are as well.
Certainly. And by parallel, that's a model for government and society. When it comes to things that we have to regulate, fund, and so forth together, let's find an area of commonality.
I agree.
And let's leave to freedom everything else. And I know you've worked by that and have done great service.
Right.
My guest today has been J.N. Musto, Executive Director of the University of Hawaii Professional Assembly. I'm Keli'i Akina, President of Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, where we believe in individual liberty, free markets, and limited accountable government. I think these are things J.N. Musto also believes in, and I want to thank you for being here.
I'm a real libertarian at heart.
Glad to know that. And we thank you for being with us today. Jay Fidel and ThinkTech Hawaii, aloha to you for the great work that you're doing. And we will be back again with you on E Hana Kako, which means let's work together in 1 week. Aloha.
Very good.